Welcome back to the channel, history enthusiasts. Today we're exploring one of the most pivotal yet often overlooked conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War. Spanning from 1950 to 1953, this war not only shaped the geopolitics of East Asia but also laid the foundation for the intense Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Whether you're a longtime history lover or just looking to understand this crucial chapter, you've come to the right place. Let's dive deep into the Korean War. Before we even get to the first shots fired, it's essential to understand how the Korean Peninsula ended up divided and the backdrop to the conflict. Korea had been under Japanese rule since 1910, but after Japan's defeat in World War II, the Allied powers were tasked with deciding its future. In 1945, the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel into two occupation zones, North Korea controlled by the Soviet Union and South Korea by the United States. This division was meant to be temporary, but with the rise of Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it became permanent. In the North, the Soviets helped establish a communist government led by Kim Il-sung, while in the South, the U.S. supported a pro-Western capitalist government led by Syngman Rhee. Tensions mounted as both leaders sought to unify Korea under their own ideologies, and by 1948, two separate states were born: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea. As the ideological divide deepened, the stage was set for conflict. The ambitions of Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee, coupled with the geopolitical tensions of the time, ultimately culminated in the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for both Korea and the world. The stage was set. Both leaders, backed by their respective superpowers, began to prepare for a showdown, believing that only through force could Korea be unified under their rule. The outbreak of the Korean War. It's June 25, 1950. In the early hours of the morning, North Korean forces, heavily equipped with Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, artillery, and advanced weaponry, crossed the 38th parallel in a carefully coordinated and devastating assault on South Korea. The invasion, spearheaded by the Korean People's Army, KPA, was not a spontaneous act but the culmination of months of meticulous planning and military buildup under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, with significant backing from the Soviet Union and tacit support from Communist China. The goal was clear: to reunify the Korean peninsula under a communist regime, effectively ending the division that had been imposed after World War II. Korea, once a single nation under Japanese colonial rule, had been divided along the 38th parallel in 1945, with the Soviet Union occupying the North and the United States overseeing the South. This division, intended to be temporary, hardened into a permanent geopolitical fracture as Cold War tensions escalated. In the South, the Republic of Korea, ROK, led by President Syngman Rhee, was caught off guard. Despite warnings and rising tensions, the South Korean military was poorly equipped and inadequately prepared to repel the northern offensive. North Korean forces, in contrast, launched a blitzkrieg-style attack, swiftly overwhelming South Korean defenses and advancing towards the capital city of Seoul. The invasion sent shockwaves across the world. The United Nations, with the United States at the forefront, swiftly condemned the attack. On June 27, 1950, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 83, calling for member nations to assist South Korea in repelling the invasion. This marked the beginning of a brutal three-year conflict that would see immense destruction, countless civilian casualties, and significant international involvement. The Korean War was not merely a regional conflict but a critical flashpoint in the Cold War. It exposed the deep ideological divide between communism and democracy, with the Korean Peninsula becoming the stage for a proxy war between global superpowers. The war would reshape international relations, military strategies, and the lives of millions caught in its path. The UN counterattack. Now we turn to one of the most dramatic moments of the war. After holding the Pusan perimeter and stabilizing their position, General Douglas MacArthur planned a daring counteroffensive, the Incheon Landing. On September 15, 1950, UN forces launched an amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city on the west coast of the Korean Peninsula. The operation was an extraordinary gamble due to Incheon's narrow tides, unpredictable weather, and heavily fortified defenses. However, the landing was a resounding success, catching the North Koreans completely off guard and cutting off their supply lines. UN forces rapidly advanced inland, liberating Seoul by late September. The North Korean army, now disorganized and facing logistical collapse, retreated in haste. Buoyed by their success, General MacArthur pushed UN forces northward, crossing the 38th parallel and advancing towards the Yalu River, the border with China. The goal was to reunify the peninsula under a non-communist government. However, this bold move proved to be a costly miscalculation. Alarmed by the presence of U.S. and UN troops near their border, Communist China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, decided to intervene. In late October 1950, waves of Chinese troops, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, crossed the Yalu River in a surprise counteroffensive. The Chinese forces, well prepared and familiar with the mountainous terrain, overwhelmed the advancing UN troops, forcing them into a chaotic retreat. What had seemed like an imminent victory for the UN forces turned into a prolonged and grueling conflict. The war escalated with heavy casualties on both sides, and the prospect of a quick resolution faded into uncertainty. The Korean War had transformed into an even bloodier and more complex struggle, with no clear end in sight. The Stalemate. By early 1951, the front lines had stabilized roughly around the original 38th parallel, and the war entered a phase of trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. The fighting became relentless and bloody, with neither side able to make significant territorial gains despite countless offensives and counteroffensives. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme weather conditions, food shortages, and continuous artillery bombardments in muddy, fortified trenches. In addition to conventional combat, the war saw the widespread use of aerial bombing campaigns. The United States launched an extensive strategic bombing campaign against North Korea, targeting cities, industrial facilities, and transportation infrastructure. Entire cities, including Pyongyang, were reduced to rubble, and tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives. The scorched earth tactics aimed to cripple North Korea's ability to continue the war. Meanwhile, Chinese and North Korean forces launched fierce ground offensives, attempting to break UN defensive lines and reclaim lost territory. These offensives often resulted in staggering casualties on both sides, with little to no territorial gains. The war also inflicted immense suffering on civilians. Millions of Koreans were displaced from their homes, forced to live in makeshift refugee camps or flee across dangerous war zones. Entire families were separated, and starvation and disease became rampant. Estimates suggest that by the end of the war, over 3 million people had died, with civilians making up the majority of the casualties. Rumors of chemical and biological weapons being used during the conflict have persisted, but conclusive evidence remains elusive. Regardless, the sheer brutality of the conflict left deep scars on the Korean peninsula, both physically and emotionally. The stalemate dragged on for over 2 years, with peace talks beginning in July 1951 but repeatedly stalling over issues such as prisoner exchanges and border demarcation. As the war continued, exhaustion set in on both sides, but neither was willing to make significant concessions. The Korean War had become a war of attrition, with no clear path to victory for either side. The Armistice and aftermath. After years of bloody fighting, both sides began to realize that a military victory was unlikely. Negotiations for peace began in 1951 but dragged on for another 2 years. On July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom, effectively ending the fighting but not formally concluding the war. The Korean peninsula remained divided along the 38th parallel, with a heavily fortified demilitarized zone, DMZ, separating the two countries. The armistice created a fragile peace, but the political division between North and South Korea remained deeply entrenched. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, solidified into a totalitarian communist state with a heavily centralized economy and pervasive state control. Meanwhile, South Korea, under Syngman Rhee, gradually evolved into a capitalist democracy, though not without significant political turmoil and authoritarian tendencies in its early years. Despite the cessation of hostilities, tensions never fully dissipated. The Korean War technically never ended, as a formal peace treaty was never signed. The ideological and political rift between North and South Korea only deepened over time, setting the stage for decades of confrontation, military buildup, and periodic clashes along the DMZ. The legacy of the Korean War continues to shape the geopolitics of East Asia to this day, with the Korean Peninsula remaining one of the most heavily militarized regions in the world. The legacy of the Korean War. The Korean War left an indelible mark on the region and the world. For the United States, the war reinforced the policy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of communism. The conflict also demonstrated the global reach of the Cold War, with both superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, directly and indirectly involved. For Korea, the war solidified the division of the peninsula, a division that continues to define the region's geopolitics today. The war had profound cultural, economic, and political impacts on both North and South Korea. North Korea became one of the world's most isolated and repressive regimes, while South Korea eventually transitioned from a dictatorship to a thriving democracy. The enduring conflict between these two nations continues to shape global relations, especially in relation to North Korea's nuclear ambitions. More than 70 years later, the Korean War's legacy is still felt today, with both Koreas constantly in the international spotlight. It serves as a stark reminder of how ideological and military conflicts can shape the future of entire nations. And that's a wrap on our detailed look at the Korean War. From its origins to its devastating effects, the conflict stands as a pivotal chapter in modern history. It's a story of resilience, tragedy, and the far-reaching consequences of global ideological battles. If you found this video insightful, be sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. As always, let us know what historical events you'd like us to explore next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.